Theory of visual rhetoric. In this lesson, I tried to explain to you how visual rhetoric has come into existence. It is in fact a latest area of academic interest. In the lesson, we learn about whether every visual has potential to give rise to rhetoric. The question before us is whether it is easy to understand every visual in terms of the meaning of rhetoric, which is more contested term in politics. There are various views expressed by different scholars at different times. The present lesson expounds all such variations in a comprehensive way and finally outlines the conditions that visual has to meet with in order to be eligible for a visual rhetoric. To inform the learner about various dimensions of the term rhetoric, since it is first entry during Aristotle time, to enrich the learner about the transformation of the term rhetoric into communication, to educate the learner about the various conflicts and controversies around considering rhetoric of a visual imagery of a visual. According to Fass, visual rhetoric is the term used to describe the study of visual imagery within the discipline of rhetoric. As a branch of knowledge, rhetoric dates back to classical Greece and is concerned with the study of the use of symbols to communicate. In the most basic sense, rhetoric is an ancient term for what now typically is called communication. Visual rhetoric is a very new area of study within this century's old discipline. Not until 1970 was the first formal call made to include visual images in the study of rhetoric, which until then had been conceived exclusively as verbal discourse. The National Conference on Rhetoric, convened by the Speech Communication Association, the US, called for an expansion of the study of rhetoric to include subjects which have not traditionally fallen within the critic's purview: the non-discursive as well as discursive, the non-verbal as well as the verbal. Solon et al. Argued rhetorical perspective may be applied to any human act, process, product or artifact that may formulate, sustain or modify attention, perceptions, attitudes or behavior. Kenneth Burke, rhetorical theorist, also contributed to the emergence of rhetorical scholarship on visual images. Burke's articulation of symbolicity included not only talk but also all other human symbol systems, and he encouraged the analysis of symbols in all of their forms, including mathematics, music, sculpture, painting, dance, architectural styles and so on. The door to the rhetorical study of images swung open farther as rhetorical scholars such as Douglas Ehninger, whose standing among traditional rhetoricians was undisputed, proposed a definition of rhetoric as an inclusive visual. He defined rhetoric as the ways in which humans may influence each other's thinking and behavior through the strategic use of symbols, and suggested as appropriate subject matter for rhetorical study such as art, architecture, dance and dress. Current definitions of rhetoric continue to support the expansion of rhetorical study beyond its traditional concern for verbal text. Definitions of rhetoric such as the social function that influences and manages meanings suggest that easy fit between the visual image and rhetoric. Proposals to expand rhetoric to encompass the visual were met at first with vociferous objections. Such objections included the concern that rhetoricians' lack of knowledge about visual images. Waldo W. Braden, for example, suggested that rhetorical critics simply are not trained to deal with images or other forms of no discursive rhetoric, to argue that by inclination and by training, most of us are best qualified to study the speech of rhetorical act. Another reason cited for reluctance of rhetorical scholars to tackle the study of visual images had less to do with personal competences and more with their desire to accumulate theoretical insights into rhetoric. Patton suggested that a redefinition of rhetoric to include non-linguistic symbols represented a kind of rhetorical dislocation and a break from clear connections with a central theoretical core. Other scholars of rhetoric suggested that imagery as a rhetorical form is tainted when compared to discourse in terms of its impact on public communication. Although these rhetoricians did not oppose the study of visual imagery, they privileged the study of discourse over the visual because of what they saw as the superior properties of Neil Postman, for example, argued that the visual epistemology of television pollutes public communication and contributes to a decline in the seriousness, clarity and above all value of public discourse. Similarly, David Jarofsky suggested that rhetorical forms such as visual images stand in for a more complex reality, contributing to the deterioration of a rich and vibrant concept of argument of public deliberation. Kathleen Hall Jamieson asserted that images are particularly susceptible to a truncation of argument and that the cognitive processing of images is less conscious and critical than processing that occurs in the assignment of meaning to verbal discourse. That the study of visual images continued and indeed now flourishes in rhetorical studies is because of a number of factors. Primary among them is the pervasiveness of the visual image and its impact on contemporary culture. Images in the form of advertisements, television, film, architecture, interior design and dress constitute a major part of the rhetorical environment, and such images now have the significance for the contemporary culture that speeches once did. As much as rhetorical scholars may feel nostalgia for culture in which public speeches were the symbols that had primary impact, that culture is gone. To restrict the study of symbol use only to verbal discourse means studying minuscule portion of the symbols that affect individuals daily. The study of visual image from a rhetorical perspective also has grown with the emerging recognition that visual image provide access to a range of human experience not always available through the study of discourse. Because theories of rhetoric have focused on and have been developed from the study of discursive symbols, they feature the dimensions of rhetorical processes that can be captured through discourse. Human experiences that are spatially oriented, non-linear, multi-dimensional and dynamic often can be communicated only through visual imagery or other non-discursive symbols. To understand and articulate such experience requires attention to these kinds of symbols. Another force prompting the rhetorical study of visual imagery is the desire for greater comprehensiveness and inclusiveness in rhetorical theory. Hart was correct in suggesting that rhetorical theory has been created almost exclusively from the study of discourse. As a result, rhetoricians lack understanding of the conventions through which meaning is created in visual images and the processes by which images influence viewers. By situating visual imagery at the periphery of their rhetorical theories, rhetorical scholars have evoked information about important communicative processes, resulting in adequate, incomplete and distorted understandings of symbols. Attention to visual symbols provide a more holistic picture of symbol use. As a result of nascent efforts to explore visual phenomena rhetorically, the term visual rhetoric now has two meanings in the discipline of rhetoric. It is used to mean both a visual object or artifact and a perspective on the study of visual data. In the first sense, visual rhetoric is a product individuals create as they use visual symbols for the purpose of communicating. In the second, it is a perspective scholars apply that focuses on the symbolic processes by which images perform communication. Visual rhetoric, a communicative artifact. Conceptualized as a communicative artifact, visual rhetoric is the actual image rhetorics generate when they use visual symbols for the purpose of communicating. It is the tangible evidence or product of the creative act, such as painting, an advertisement or a building, and constitutes that of study for rhetorical scholars interested in visual symbols. Visual rhetoric as an artifact is conceptualized broadly to include both 2- and 3-dimensional images such as paintings, sculpture, furniture, architecture and interior design. The images included under the rubric of visual rhetoric are equally broad in terms of their functions. Both aesthetic and utilitarian images constitute visual rhetoric works of art as well as advertisements. For example, not every visual object is visual rhetoric. What turns a visual object into a communicative artifact, a symbol that communicates and can be studied as rhetoric, is the presence of 3 characteristics. In other words, 3 markers must be evident for a visual image to qualify as a visual rhetoric. The image must be symbolic, involve human intervention and be presented to audience for the purpose of communicating with that audience. Symbolic action. Visual rhetoric, like all communications, is a system of signs. In this simplest sense, a sign communicates when it is connected to another subject, as the changing of leaves in autumn is connected to a change in temperature, or a stop sign is connected to the act of stopping a car while driving. To qualify as visual rhetoric, an image must go beyond serving as a sign, however, and be symbolic, with that image only indirectly connected to its referent. The shape and color of the stop sign, for example, have no natural relationship to the act of stopping a car as it is being driven. These dimensions of the sign were invented arbitrarily by someone who needed a way to regulate traffic. A stop sign then counts as visual rhetoric because it involves the use of arbitrary symbols to communicate. Human intervention. Visual rhetoric involves human action of some kind. Humans are involved in the generation of visual rhetoric in the process of image creation, painting a watercolor or taking a photograph. For example, the process involves the conscious decision to communicate as well as conscious choices about the strategies to employ in areas such as color, form, media and size. Human intervention in the visual rhetoric also may assume the form of transforming non-rhetorical visual images into visual rhetoric. Visual rhetoric then requires human action either in the process of creation or in the process of interpretation. Presence of an audience. Visual rhetoric implies an audience and is concerned with an appeal either to a real and ideal audience. Visual elements are arranged and modified by rhetoric not for self-expression, although that may constitute a major motive for the creator of an image, but also for communication with an audience. The creator of an image can serve that audience. The audience need not be external to the rhetoric. Visual rhetoric as a perspective. The term visual rhetoric is used in the discipline of rhetoric to refer not only to the visual object as a communicative artifact, it also refers to a perspective scholars may take on a visual image or visual data. In this meaning of the term, visual rhetoric constitutes a theoretical perspective that involves the analysis of the symbolic or communicative aspects of visual rhetoric. Visual rhetoric as a theoretical perspective or what might be called a rhetorical perspective on visual imagery to distinguish it from the other sense of visual rhetoric is a critical analytical tool of a way of approaching and analyzing visual data that highlights the communicative dimensions of images. It is a particular way of viewing images, a set of conceptual lenses through which visual images become knowable as communicative or rhetorical phenomena. Visual rhetoric as a perspective is not a theory which constructs and axioms that describe specific rhetorical components of visual imagery. In fact, the content that emerges from the application of the perspective is virtually limitless, bounds only by the perspective of focus on how visual artifacts function communicatively. Key to rhetorical perspective on images and what makes the perspective a rhetorical one is its focus on a rhetorical response to an image rather than an aesthetic one. An aesthetic response consists of a viewer's direct perceptual encounter with the aspects of image. In a rhetoric response, in contrast, meaning is attributed to the image. Colors, lines, textures and rhythms in an image provide a basis for the viewer to infer the existence of images, emotions and ideas. The visual rhetoric perspective's focus is on understanding rhetorical responses to images. A rhetorical perspective on visual imagery also is characterized by specific attention to one or more of three aspects of visual images: their nature, function and evaluation. The study of the nature of visual imagery is primary. To explicate function or to evaluate visual image requires an understanding of the substantive and stylistic nature of those images. Nature of the image. Essential to an application of a rhetorical perspective is explication of the distinguishing features of the visual image. Description of the nature of the visual rhetoric involves attention to two components: presented elements and suggested elements. Identification of the presented elements of an image involves naming the major physical features of the image. At this stage, the scholar describes such presented elements as space, which concern the mass size of the image; media, the materials of which the image is constructed; and shapes, the forms featured in the image. The scholar then identifies suggested elements, which are the concepts, ideas, themes and allusions that a viewer is likely to infer from the presented elements. Analysis of the presented and suggested elements allows the scholar to understand the primary communicative elements of an image and consequently develop a meaning of the image is likely to have for an audience. Function of the image. A second focus for scholars who take a rhetorical perspective on visual imagery can be the function of functions the visual rhetoric serves for an audience. Scholars who focus on function attempt to discover how the image operates for these viewers. Function, as it is used in this perspective, is not synonymous with the purpose, which involves an offer that is intended to or desired by the creator of the image. Scholars who adopt a rhetorical perspective on the visual image do not see the creator's intentions as determining the correct interpretation of a work. Not only may the scholar not have access to biographical or historical evidence about the intentions of the creators of images, but not be able to give clear verbal accounts of their intentions and even may about what motivated them. In addition, a privileging of creators the interpretations over the interpretations of the viewers closes off possibilities for new ways of experiencing the image. Once an image is created, scholars who adopt a rhetorical perspective on imagery believes it stands independent of its creator's intention. The function of an image from a rhetorical perspective is the action the image communicates. Evaluation of the image. A third area in which scholars may focus as they apply a perspective of visual rhetoric is evaluation. They may be interested in assessing an image, which can be done in a number of ways. Some scholars choose to evaluate an image using the criterion of whether it accomplishes the functions suggested by the image itself. If an image functions to memorialize someone, for example, such an evaluation would involve discovery of whether its media, color, forms and content actually accomplish that function. Other scholars choose to evaluate images by scrutinizing their functions, reflecting on their legitimacy or soundness, determined largely by the implications and consequences of the functions. Such an assessment is made according to scholars' reasons for analyzing an image to discover whether the image is congruent with a particular ethical system or whether it offers an emancipatory potential. For example, whatever criteria are used, scholars who adopt a rhetorical perspective on images and choose to focus on evaluation are interested in improving the quality of the rhetorical environment by discriminating among images. Studies of images from a rhetorical perspective, whether focused on nature, function, evaluation, assume one of two forms. Some scholars deductively apply rhetorical cones and constructs to visual imagery to investigate questions about rhetoric and contribute to existing rhetorical theories generated from the study of discourse. A second approach involves an inductive investigation of visual images designed to highlight the features of the visual images themselves as a means to generate rhetorical theory that is expanded to include the visual. Deductive application. Scholars who apply a rhetorical perspective deductively use to illustrate, explain or investigate rhetorical construct and theories formulated from the study of discourse. They begin with rhetorical constructs and theories formulated begin with rhetorical constructs and theories and use them to guide them through the visual artifact. Underlying this approach is the assumption that visual images possesses essentially the same characteristics that discursive symbols do. Consequently, the visual image is treated as a language-like symbol, and in most of the deductive studies, discursive artifacts could have been used just as well as visual ones to investigate rhetorical processes being explored and with similar outcomes. The result of these studies is a contribution to a rhetorical theory focused on verbal discourse. Virtually any theory or construct from rhetorical theory can serve as a guiding analytical tool in the deductive analysis of images. Greg Dickinson analyzed the town of Old Pasadena using the construct of memory. Janice L. Edwards and Carol K. Winkler explored the editorial cartoons of the photograph of the flag rising at 2 Jima using the construct of appropriation. Inductive exploration. A second approach to the application of a rhetorical perspective on visual imagery is the investigation of the features of visual images to generate rhetorical theory that takes into account the distinct characteristics of the visual symbol. Scholars who pursue this route begin with an exploration of visual images and operate inductively, generating rhetorical theories that are accumulated about visual symbols. An assumption of scholars who proceed inductively from the visual images is that visual images are different in significant ways from discursive symbols, and they are cautious about importing rhetorical theory developed from the study of discourse into the realm of visual because of these differences. As Heines suggested, the fundamental conceptualizations of rhetorical process are dominated by the thought patterns and belief systems, literate culture, and he reminds rhetorical theories of the cognitive basis underlying the rhetoric's focus on discourses. Although debates continue about the precise ways in which visual images differ from discourse, some features of visual images clearly require attention to a different elements and a different statement of those elements from what discourse does. For example, images do not express a thesis or a proposition in the way that verbal messages do. They appear to do so only because viewers attribute propositions to them. Images also lack the denotative vocabulary that characterizes visual imagery. To identify the smallest independent units of visual image that would correspond to words is difficult, if not impossible. Even if agreement were reached on the definition of the minimal units within one image, these minimal units do not have the independent meanings and are not uniquely differentiated characters that words are. Another difference between verbal and visual symbols is that language is general and abstract, while images are concrete and specific. verbal discourse is able to deal with book, for example, as an abstract and not simply a unique concept, while images are tied to physical form that requires them to deal in particularities. Visual rhetoric, as it is employed in the discipline of rhetoric, has two meanings. One refers visual communication that constitutes the object of study. The second meaning references a perspective or approach rhetorical scholars adopt as they study visual rhetoric. Together, these two senses of the term point to the need to understand how the visual operates rhetorically in contemporary culture. Visual rhetoric as communication data to be studied and as an approach to these data suggests the need to expand understanding of the multivarious ways in which symbols inform and define human experience, and constitutes a call to expand rhetorical theory, making it more inclusive in its encompassing of visual as well as verbal symbols.